Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. And investment in infrastructure is, of course, the key to lifting economic productivity in this country. Just as inadequate infrastructure impedes economic growth, traffic congestion needlessly complicates life for people as they move around their communities. Inadequate highways mean road safety issues come to the fore. A failure to have efficient freight systems, whether by rail or by road and intermodal transport, is a handbrake on productivity. So that's why every year at budget time I look forward to announcements of new nation-building projects like roads and railway lines or port infrastructure. The first step on budget night is always you look for the summary booklet from the Department of Infrastructure, or it used to be called the Department of Transport. Last year, indeed, helped greatly the booklet to identify the re-announcements of the government, because you could go to the page on the Pacific Highway or the Bruce Highway, look at the projects of May 2013, the budget on the Bruce Highway, go to next year's, and it was exactly the same. It showed that there weren't new projects on either the Bruce Highway or the Pacific Highway from the government. So this year they just didn't bother. They didn't bother to produce any documentation about infrastructure on budget night. Why? Because there were no new projects, no new public transport projects. That's not surprising, given they cut all the funding for public transport in last year's budget. No new major road projects anywhere in the country. Nothing for freight rail. Not a single new project funded in this budget for freight rail anywhere in the country. Nothing for ports or intermodal infrastructure. Nothing for high-speed rail. Indeed, this budget cuts infrastructure funding by $2 billion over the next 2 years. $2 billion cut compared with the 2014 budget, compared with what they said they would do just 1 year ago. It's no wonder that business commentator Alan Kohler wrote in the Business Spectator on May 20, any suggestion that this government is an infrastructure government is nothing more than spin. Mr Kohler wrote this: in fact, the detail of the budget papers show a real decline in spending in the infrastructure and regional development portfolio of 11.2% between 2014-15 and 2018-19, an 11.2% decline over that period. It's no wonder Mr Kohler has described the government's record on infrastructure as quote-unquote pathetic. And this is the worst possible time to cut infrastructure investment. Our economy is in a state of transition as we move away from the resources boom. According to the ABS, private sector investment fell by some 12.4% between the December quarter of 2013 and the December quarter 2014. In the same period, public sector investment on infrastructure fell by 17.3%. from the December quarter 2013 to the December quarter 2014. In these circumstances, a responsible government would have stepped up to the plate and lifted infrastructure investment. The government tries to get around these facts, and today the Deputy Prime Minister tried again. Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, this is what their analysis shows, that Commonwealth investment in infrastructure will fall from 1.55% of the budget to 1.47% across the forward estimates. And last Friday we saw exactly how big the challenge was. Infrastructure Australia produced its update of the 2008 National Infrastructure Audit. This audit found that traffic congestion would escalate the cost to $53 billion by 2031 without action. It found that public transport use will double over the next 20 years. So what is the government's response to these challenges, they withdraw all investment in public transport. The Regional Rail Link project that will open next month was the largest ever federal investment in an urban public transport project, making an enormous difference not just to the Melbourne suburban rail network but to Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo. When it opens, it'll add an extra 54,000 commuter seats a day and take thousands of cars off the roads. Projects that we funded, like the Gold Coast Light Rail. The member opposite would be very familiar with it and now is a strong supporter of it. Not at the time, but now supports it. It opened last year. It has had 5 million people travel on it in less than a year. We also funded the Moreton Bay Rail Line in Brisbane, under construction, and allocated billions of dollars of investment for projects like the Melbourne Metro and the Cross River Rail project. At the same time, we doubled the roads budget. We invested in important freight projects. The member for Parkes spoke about the Inland Rail project. They have not added a dollar, not a cent, in their first 2 budgets for that project. Every single dollar of the $300 million was allocated by the former federal Labor government, and indeed our rollout was faster. They spent less than we would have over the first 2 years of this government. So we need to invest in both roads and rail. All of the experts know that that is the case. We need to engage in cities and urban policy. We can't have a situation whereby the Commonwealth simply says that it is the business of someone else to deal with these issues, when 80% of Australians live in our cities. Our cities produce more than 80% of the GDP. In his 1972 election campaign speech, Gough Whitlam said this: "A national government which has nothing to say about cities has nothing relevant or enduring to say about the nation or the nation's future." And yet this government has shut down the Major Cities Unit. With regard to the State of Australian Cities reports, it was due, the next one in 2014. They said they would produce it, but in fact it hasn't been published. But we know that the Department of Infrastructure and Transport signed an $11,000 contract with a printing agency for the 2014 report, and the contract stipulated, available on the government website, that the report would be printed on December 15, or published on December 15 last year. So it had to be printed, obviously, prior to the publication of the report. Where is it? $11,000 hasn't appeared, has just disappeared. Maybe it had something in it that was slightly critical. We don't know. We do know that this report, of which the first 3 years there were 3 million full copies downloaded of this report, such as the want for information on urban policy in cities. We do know that there is a demand there. We know the government has repeatedly, at each and every estimate, said that it would produce it. We know that it's been produced and printed and paid for, but it's just disappeared, The government, of course, has also undermined the Infrastructure Australia process. Its key advisor on infrastructure, Infrastructure Australia, has of course been sidelined from the funding decisions that have been made by the government. They haven't funded a single Infrastructure Australia priority project since they came into office. They said there'd be cost-benefit analysis for projects above $100 million. There has been none. And when the East-West Link cost-benefit was actually exposed by the incoming Victorian state government, it showed that there was a cost-benefit of 0.45, or 45 cents benefit for every dollar that was invested. And yet this government stubbornly says that's where the money should go. Not to remove level crossings, not for the M80 project, not for the Melbourne Metro project, not for the Westgate project. but for a project that simply doesn't stack up. So this year's budget shows that the funding of Infrastructure Australia has been slashed from $15 million this year to $8.8 billion by 2018-19, cut by half in real terms, more than half. An absurd proposition. No wonder when they're ignoring Infrastructure Australia. They're ignoring cost-benefit analysis, and they simply don't have credibility when it comes to the decisions that are being made, including the vindictive decision that is in this budget and showed by the papers. Now, these budget papers show that Victoria, with 25% of Australia's population, will get 8% of the infrastructure investment contribution from the Commonwealth. 8%. If this Prime Minister thinks that Victorians will cop being punished because they voted for a Labor government last year, then he will find out what the response is come the next federal election. Because no group, no state or territory would cop that sort of behaviour from a federal government. That's why, in the Leader of the Opposition's budget reply, he made it clear that a Labor government will give Infrastructure Australia the status it deserves at the centre of government. We will act on expert advice as we did previously. We will also make sure that there's proper consultation, including with the opposition, on key appointments to the organisation. Now, if you want an example of mean-spirited decisions that make no sense, there's one that stood out to me in the budget, because it's a separate line item, the Regional School Buses program. That's a program that's about getting seatbelts in school buses that operate in regional areas. You know how much it cost, Mr Deputy Speaker? $1 million. $1 million cut by those opposite. By those opposite. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to engage in that sort of cut. The Managed Motorways Fund, which funds better infrastructure, smart infrastructure, using better signalling systems to make better use of roads that are there, cut in last year's budget in terms of the Monash Freeway, no new allocations. Labor's successful Heavy Vehicle Safety and Productivity program, cut with only $1 million of last year's $48 million that was budgeted actually spent. The government has even cut funding to its own Bridges Renewal program by $60 million. An extraordinary proposition. And then we move to the ideological section of this budget, where they have in page 132, on budget paper 2, they say this in terms of shipping, that they want to better aligning, the reforms are aimed at, quote, better aligning employment conditions for ships based in Australia with international standards. Can you imagine actually explicitly saying in black and white that you want third world wages and conditions for Australians who work on ships? But of course we know that it's not just the shipping sector where they want to move to work choices on water, but they also want work choices in the sky by abolishing cabotage that ensures that only Australian-based airlines can operate in our domestic industry, as occurs everywhere in the world. There is nowhere in the world in which Qantas can go and say, I want to operate in your domestic route in the United States of America or in Europe or anywhere else. And yet, that is what they are proposing to open up. Madam Deputy Speaker, last year's budget shocked Australians with its savagery, but this year's budget is no better. In infrastructure and transport, it reveals the government's inability to deal with the challenges ahead. This nation needs an adult government prepared to invest in nation building. This country needs leadership on infrastructure, it needs nation building, it needs vision, and it needs a Labor government.
Hear, hear. The question is that this